Welcome to the rainiest Cape Town I've seen in a while. I'm coming to town to help a friend who's getting a whole bunch of organizations together to see, is it worth them starting another non-profit in Cape Town? If you don't know anything about non-profits, one of the biggest misconceptions is that they should work together more. I don't know if it's a misconception so much as it's a way of thinking that sits on top of this idea that spending money for a non-profit is better spent if you spend less. Let me explain what I mean. Let's say you want to open a coffee shop. Cape Town's great for coffee. It's full of hipster coffee shops, has been for years. Oh, by the way, what do you call a hipster? No. Damn. This is going to be a very boring video. Why did the hipster burn his lips? She drank a coffee before school. There we go, I got it. As you saw what happened there, really, I was trying not to say or the hell out of you before my attempted videos even started. But to get back to the story, if you run a hipster, really rock and roll coffee shop, you know, you get people that come, you're selling something special around your coffee, you believe in it, you know that people want it. Even if there's another hipster joint just down the road, it doesn't really occur to anyone to say to you, why didn't you join with those people? But for non-profits, for some reason it does. So the one we're going to tomorrow, they started in South Africa 20 years ago now. They're called City Year, as in a year in the city. It's a word that makes a lot more sense, or at least sounds clearer if you say year in American. In South Africa, we don't get the R's to come out properly. So City Year, try to tell that to somebody on the phone, they have no idea what you mean. But in the States, the name's pretty self-explanatory. It's a year in the city. So they're a bit like a domestic Peace Corps program in the US. But they started in the late 90s with a pretty cool, these two sort of strange and different ideas. One was around diversity. So Donald Trump's favorite, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So just this idea that people come from lots of different backgrounds, right? So especially in American cities, they're kind of notorious for that, the way that they're racially divided. So their idea was, what if you get young people to spend a year in the city, their own city even, or a city they don't know, with people different from themselves. So people have just finished university, people about to go to university, people who have dropped out of school, people who've recently moved to the country, people from relatively wealthy backgrounds who are not sure what they want to do after school, people from tougher backgrounds that haven't gotten into university, haven't got the funding to go to university. What if you put them together and you use their youth and energy to make a difference? You have them working in schools, and then on top of that, you have this demonstration of the power that can come from people working together who look different, regardless of their experiences themselves, what that felt like. That was the first crazy idea. The second one was to sponsor them the way you would the Olympics. So City Year in the US are known as the Red Jackets in all the cities that they work in, except one of the California ones, which was drug-related branding. Do drug and gangs have drug distributing gangs? Do they have brands? Anyway, so the red color was potentially problematic in some neighborhoods. So I think City Year in San Jose, in Silicon Valley, and now I'm starting to sound more American, is their colors are yellow. So they wear yellow jackets. But City Year in Boston, where it started, they wore red, and then also they were sponsored and still are by Timberland. So you know Tim's, the way those boots became super famous. I mean, they still are, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were beyond famous. So young people wear City Year uniforms, these red jackets, kind of formal. They wear chinos and golf shirts. They look serious, they look really good, and they've got these red bomber jackets or raincoats with Tim's. Anyway, so tomorrow's meeting is in Cape Town. I'm just coming into the city now. It's raining pretty hard. I don't know, am I going to get arrested if I do this? Have a look outside the window if you don't know what the city looks like. We're talking about getting into the city. Yeah, so the meeting tomorrow is about City Year South Africa, that's been running programs for 20 years now. One of their board members has lived in Cape Town for the last couple of years, and they are exploring opening a City Year in Cape Town. The first one in South Africa, the only one currently, opened in Johannesburg 2005, and it was actually one of my first jobs out of university. So I was what was called a team leader in Johannesburg when I was about 25. So I had a team of 10 young people from hugely different backgrounds, race, language, religion, all those things. And we worked for a year. We were one of 12 teams working across Johannesburg, and we worked in a neighborhood called Yeovil, really fascinating place, in a school. And then in that process, I became their program director or service manager. It was my job to organize the service that we did. And I got to know Johannesburg backwards, like every neighborhood, every different stretch of it. It was really an amazing experience. And so I've always felt like I owe the city of a debt. And the current executive director asked me if there's a way that I could potentially help in some way. And so that's what I'm doing. So back to the point of this video. What does that mean for nonprofits? And in this series, what are you going to learn? I'm not going to be talking about nonprofits. I'm not talking about NGOs. What I care about is growth and justice. Whatever you might think those things mean, I'm curious. Put them in the comments below. But for me, growth is about the personal journey we're all on, right? Like, we can all be better tomorrow than we were yesterday. You know, there are these moments in our lives, you're having them now, or you had it when you were 12, or whatever, when you sort of see yourself a little bit differently, and you realize you could become something else, whether that's, you know, good at the sport you play, or get into university, or get a job. You start getting this different perspective, and so you kind of develop your identity, meaning and purpose in life, all those things. That's what I mean by growth. And then justice is, you know, what should we do with that? Like, once we figure out what to do or how to be in the world as we grow, you know, that's a never-ending thing. What's the right thing to do then? Like, what should we be doing? Should we be doing anything to make the world better or more just? In South Africa, it's a little bit, at least in my mind, in some ways easier. So we have a constitution. So when Nelson Mandela was freed by the apartheid government, which themselves won an election when they kind of got semi-independence from the British government as a union of countries. So not so different to the US. But of course, you couldn't vote if you weren't white. You couldn't own land if you weren't white. And when the South African Union was created, the idea of giving the vote to everybody, including women, was quite a big part of it, actually. And South Africa, or the South African Union, was one of the first countries in the world where women could vote, these democracies. But again, you couldn't vote to own land if you weren't of direct European descent, or at least you couldn't vote in the elections that mattered, you know, for the bodies that really controlled the decisions, and for the towns where you wanted to live. And then even worse, you couldn't own land in the kind of towns that were growing fast, right? So you also couldn't really amass value. A whole other story around what happened there. I'll go on a quick tangent. Cape Town has this weird reputation, mistakenly, for somehow being different to the rest of South Africa. It isn't. Don't let anyone tell you that. One of the jokes about it is it's called the Mother City, because as far as Europeans go, it was the first European city. But Joe Burgers, where I'm from, used to always say it was called the Mother City because it takes 9 months for anything to happen here. And that's still probably true. But the side I was saying is Cape Town had this really well-respected mayor called Helen Zille. There were all these fun memes about her, comparing her to Godzilla and stuff. She was sort of an Iron Lady of South Africa, if you will. But she had a great reputation as mayor. She could speak isiXhosa, she could speak Afrikaans, she could speak English, and she had quite good struggle credentials. So she was a journalist during that apartheid era when Mandela was arrested. And if ever you've heard a bit of South Africa's struggle and even what happened in the US, there is, I'm saying again. There's an amazing thinker called Steve Biko, who when he was 28 years old, or even younger, he was studying medicine. So you could, in the early 1960s, as a black South African, in theory, apartheid was trying to build separate but equal, right? So it was trying to create universities and spaces and even towns that had the similar trajectory of growth, but you kind of each with their own. And maybe there was some of the Afrikaans, Afrikaans literally means African, so people of European descent who identified with themselves as African. Not all of them were nationalistic, not all of them believed in apartheid. In fact, many didn't. But I think some of them convinced themselves that there was some goodness, some genuine intent behind this idea of apartheid to have separate but equal, which was bullshit. Back to the story. So Steve Biko was a medical student, and then he started protesting and making a lot of noise about the fact that even in medicine, even in the sort of elite ways of studies, there was this difference if you were black or white. You were in these different trajectories, and it was so obvious to him that made no sense, that it was wrong. And then he was also a philosopher. I don't know enough about his background, but he was interested in like the meaning of life, like how this stuff all fits together. And he started challenging the people who were running the education system, and he started writing about it, and he became really influential as a writer slash philosopher. One of the ones, my favorite, is he gave this speech when he was like 28 to a bunch of people who were teachers and lecturers in the medical field, and he said the West's obsession with solving problems is why it's so problematic, that every attempt to fix a problem comes at the expense of what he called the spiritual, at the expense of relationships. And then there's this lovely quote that people use a lot, and out of context of the earlier part in the same speech, because it doesn't sound as angry as I think he meant it. But he said the West's great gift to the world is an industrial and a military look. This was like in 1961, right? And Africa's great gift is going to be to give the world a more human face. It's going to be in the sphere of human relationships. So I'll tell you his story, because Helen Ziller was one of the journalists. He ended up a few years after making that speech getting arrested for the third or fourth time by the apartheid security police, and he ended up dying in detention as this young man. So 3 or 4 years after making that amazing speech I just told you about, as a medical student, as this already sort of up and coming, globally recognized philosopher, and he sort of started or popularized the Black consciousness movement. All of this when he was like 28. Anyway, she was the journalist who basically broke open a lot of that stuff, like made that an international story. And there's even some stuff around relationships and people. So again, I don't know things personally, but she has these real credentials as being somebody who wanted to make a difference. But then after she was mayor, she became the head of her political party, and she became the premier, like the governor of the Western Cape. And she started saying stupid stuff. I mean, a bit like Trump, I guess, because she's his age, I guess, a bit younger. And she was of that generation that was engaging in Twitter. And so it became this self-feeding thing, because she obviously has a big ego. I'm sure politicians do. She's known to be a hard ass. She gets stuff done. And so she was picking fights. And I don't know, maybe I'm justifying things for her, but what famously got her into trouble is she went to visit Singapore. She looked at their development trajectory, and she came back and made this very public Twitter statement about how South Africans should get over their obsession with blaming colonialism for everything, and we should admit that some good things came from colonialism and apartheid. Dude, and like people exploded at her, understandably, and she just wouldn't listen. Like, she just stuck and still sticks to not listening to what people were saying. And I say all of that because in that history that quick thing that I painted for you of Johannesburg and Cape Town, and where people could buy houses in the 50s, South Africa is a really developed country in many ways. And what people like her don't understand, and what this podcast is really about, is that South Africa looks the way it looks development-wise. Whatever, cars, roads, pine trees, whatever those things are called. It looks like a first world country in many ways. Parts of it are. Despite apartheid and colonialism, not because of it. So South Africa managed to succeed at this kind of post-World War II sort of dream of industrializing, blah, 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 despite colonialism and apartheid, not because of them. And And I don't think people really appreciate that or understand it. And that's one of the things I want to talk to you about in this podcast, and hopefully you will understand. So I just want to wrap up today's point with where I started around growth and justice. So the South African Constitution, Mandela went to prison in the late 60s. Again, it's insane if people think about it. He was in prison for more than 30 years. There's an amazing podcast out right now by an American journalist who shadow wrote his autobiography called A Long Walk to Freedom. I'll put the link to that below. You should definitely have a listen. And he says this pretty bizarre thing. He was sitting with Mandela in the early 90s in a restaurant, like a bar somewhere, in a part of KwaZulu-Natal, while there was lots of violence and tensions in the period between Mandela was released in 1990 to when we had our first full democratic election in 1994. And around that time, he was traveling the country or whatever, so he was very busy. And while they were at this bar, eating supper and doing whatever they were doing, there was a cover band, a Beatles cover band playing. And Madiba enjoyed the music and was talking and literally did not know who they were covering. In other words, he did not know who the Beatles were. So he missed, because of apartheid, he went to prison and he missed the Beatles. I mean, he missed most of the civil rights movements. It's insane. He missed cell phones, he missed the internet, all these things. He was a very connected, academic, thoughtful man, and obviously stayed very politically connected throughout his 30 years in prison. But that just gives you a bit of an idea. It's insane. Like he literally missed the Beatles. Anyway, he came out in 1990. We had our election in 1994. And one of the things the new government did, which was a government of national unity, they were including politicians from the apartheid state got elected into that government, plus a whole lot of others. Our system is very different to the US. It's proportional. So there was an interim constitution that was done as part of a negotiation between the ANC and the whole government and all the other parties. And it means that when you run for an election, there are X amount of seats. So nobody has the kind of majority that you see what happens in the US at the moment. And you definitely don't get this like win or lose flip-flop thing, this 50% first past the post, which makes no sense to me. Someone explain that to me properly. So you get a more proportional system in South Africa. And then in 1994, they became one of the first things they did is they started working on the constitution. And the official South African constitution, ours, was adopted in 1996. It's a really powerful, beautiful document. And in its preamble, it says, we the people, and our government's structured in such a way that no matter how critical you can be of it, it really is us. We vote for our people on different levels. We the people recognize the injustices of the past. We recognize the rights of everyone who lives in this country, and it talks about that a little bit. And then it talks about we all are committed to creating a more just South Africa. So I started that speech because for me, justice has a lot to do with that. And Mandela said himself, where you end up has a big part to do with where you start. And he also said, how can I enjoy my freedom when other people aren't free? And he was talking about socioeconomic differences and all those things. So, growth and justice. Welcome to Cape Town. Let me know what you thought of my first little podcast and speech. If you'd be more interested, I'm going to do some reaction videos to American politicians, Fox News, CNN, give my perspective, what would James do, and hopefully hear some of your voices as well. Sometimes I'll be driving, sometimes I'll be talking to people, mostly I'll just be talking to you. Thanks for listening. Hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.